The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the open plains. Dust swirled in the wind, creating little clouds that drifted across the dirt roads. A solitary woman who had lived on her small farm for years stepped outside to take in the beauty of the setting sun. She was used to the quiet life that the countryside offered. No neighbors for miles, just the sounds of nature and the occasional rustle of the wind through the tall grasses. But that evening, something felt different. As she stood on the porch, her eyes wandered across the horizon. There was movement far down the road. It was a figure, barely visible against the vast emptiness, but it was enough to catch her attention. It wasn't unusual for travelers to pass through, but the way this figure moved seemed strange. Slow, staggering. Curiosity tugged at her. She wiped the sweat from her brow and adjusted her worn-out boots before making her way toward the figure. As she got closer, her suspicion grew. The man appeared to be struggling, one hand clutching his side while the other held onto a horse that looked just as tired as he was. The woman hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should approach. In these parts, people didn't always take kindly to strangers, especially those who looked like they were in trouble. But her sense of compassion overcame her hesitation. She couldn't just leave him out there. "Hey, you all right?" she called, her voice carrying in the quiet air. The cowboy, his face pale and strained, looked up at her. His eyes were bloodshot and there was a deep cut on his cheek. Sweat dripped from his brow and his breath came in ragged gasps. It was clear he'd been through something harsh. I'm fine," he said, though his words were barely a whisper. "Just need to rest." The woman took a step forward, studying the man closely. He was tall, his cowboy hat slightly tilted as if it had been knocked out of place in a struggle. His boots were worn and dusty, and his clothes were torn in places. The horse beside him seemed to mirror his state, exhausted and in need of care. "You sure?" she asked, her voice softening. "You don't look fine." "You're hurt." He nodded weakly but didn't offer more. The woman felt a pang of concern, knowing that he was too proud to admit the truth, even though it was written all over his face. "Look, I don't know where you're headed, but I have a barn just up the road," she said, offering him a lifeline. "I'll help you get there. You can rest for a while." The cowboy hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the road. He seemed like he wanted to decline but didn't have the strength. After a moment of silence, he nodded. I appreciate it." She moved toward him, careful not to startle the horse. The cowboy winced slightly as he shifted, and the woman caught sight of a deeper bruise on his side. He was clearly in pain. Together they made their way toward the barn. The woman's farm wasn't large, but it had everything she needed. Enough space for a small herd of cattle, a few chickens, and of course, the barn that she kept for storing hay and tools. It had always been a place of peace for her, a sanctuary from the quiet life she lived. Once inside the barn, she helped the cowboy dismount. He staggered a bit but managed to stay upright. She led him to a pile of fresh hay near the corner of the barn, where she had a few blankets laid out. "Here," she said, offering him a seat on the hay. "You can rest here. I'll get you some water." The cowboy nodded gratefully, finally letting out a deep breath as he lowered himself onto the hay. She left him for a moment, retrieving a jug of water from the small kitchen in the house. When she returned, she found him resting with his eyes closed, his face tired but relieved. She set the water down beside him and knelt down to check his wounds. The cut on his cheek needed cleaning and his side looked bruised, though it wasn't bleeding. She had never been one to shy away from hard work, and she knew enough about first aid to help him. While she worked, the cowboy remained quiet. He winced now and then but didn't complain. The woman kept to herself, focused on helping him as she had done countless times for her animals. "There," she said finally, after cleaning his wound and bandaging him up. "That should hold for now. I'll check on you again later." He gave her a small nod, his eyes finally opening. They locked eyes for a brief moment, and she could see a flicker of gratitude there, mixed with something else, something guarded. But before she could say anything, he looked away. "You've been kind," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "I didn't expect that." "I know how it feels to be alone out here," she replied, offering a small smile. "I'm just glad to help." The woman stood and dusted her hands off, then turned toward the door. "I'll let you rest. I'll be back later with some food." The cowboy didn't reply, but she could tell he appreciated the gesture. She closed the barn door softly behind her and returned to her house, feeling a strange mix of concern and curiosity. She hadn't expected to find a man in need, let alone one who seemed as lost as he appeared. That night, as the woman went about her usual routine, her thoughts kept drifting back to the cowboy. Who was he? How had he gotten so far from civilization? And why had he come this way? She wasn't used to strangers, especially those who seemed to carry a weight on their shoulders. But there was something about him that stirred her curiosity. She couldn't help but wonder if this was more than just a random encounter. The feeling lingered, tugging at her as she finished her chores. But for now, all she could do was wait and see what tomorrow brought. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the distance. The woman worked in her kitchen, setting the table for one. It was rare for her to have company, let alone a stranger from who knew where. The thought of him, lying in her barn, recovering, kept popping up in her mind. She tried to push it aside, but something about the whole situation felt off. She couldn't explain it, but there was a weight to the encounter that she couldn't shake. She busied herself with dinner, though the motions felt mechanical. There was a large pot of stew on the stove, a simple enough meal, but the silence made it feel heavier than it was. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the cowboy standing by the barn door watching her, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of land leading into the night. Her mind wandered again. Who was he? How had he ended up here, so far from the nearest town? Was he running from something? Or had he just gotten lost on his travels? The more she thought about it, the more questions came up. But one thing she was sure of, he was in trouble. She could see it in his eyes. Once dinner was ready, she placed a bowl and a spoon on the table. It wasn't much, but it was all she could offer. The woman had lived on this land for years, and there were many times when the only company she had was the sound of her own voice or the animals in the barn. But tonight it was different. She wasn't used to having someone around, especially someone who had so clearly been through a hardship. The cowboy was still in the barn when she went to check on him, his figure barely visible in the dim light of the barn. She couldn't help but notice how still he was, his back propped against the haystack, his face slightly turned toward the ceiling as though lost in thought. She had been careful not to intrude on his space, but it seemed like the right time to make sure he was okay. "Hey," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I brought you some food." The cowboy didn't immediately respond. Instead, he shifted slightly, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. He was still pale, his breath shallow, but he managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice raspy as though it had been a while since he'd spoken much. "I'm grateful." She set the bowl down on the hay near him and took a step back, giving him the space he seemed to need. "Eat slowly," she suggested, feeling a bit awkward in the silence that followed. "You've been through a lot." The cowboy nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he reached for the bowl and began to eat. His hands were steady, but there was something distant in his eyes. It was clear that he was thankful, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in a world that the woman couldn't see. She stood nearby, unsure whether to stay or leave him to his meal. After a moment, she cleared her throat, hoping to start some kind of conversation. "Where are you from?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious. The cowboy stopped eating for a moment, his eyes flicking toward her. It was the first time he had really looked at her directly, and for a split second she saw something in his gaze, an emptiness, a weariness that spoke of far more than just a few injuries. He hesitated before answering. "Nowhere in particular," he said slowly, his voice low. "Just been traveling for a while." The woman frowned. There was a sense of vagueness in his answer, a reluctance to share anything more. She didn't press him. It wasn't her place to ask too many questions, especially when he had already been kind enough to accept her help. "All right," she said quietly. "Well, you're safe here for the night." He gave a small nod but didn't respond further. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet full of unspoken words. The woman couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to this place, what kind of life he had led to make him so distant, so reluctant to open up. But as she watched him eat, she realized that it didn't matter for now. What mattered was that he was here, recovering, and that she had done what she could to help. After a few more minutes, she excused herself, leaving him to finish his meal. She returned to her house, her mind still swirling with questions. But there was nothing more she could do for him tonight. He needed rest, and so did she. The evening passed in a haze, She ate her own meal, but the food felt bland and her thoughts were far away. As the sky darkened, she lit a small lantern and set it on the table beside her. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, creating an eerie atmosphere in the otherwise peaceful house. She tried to distract herself with the simple tasks she had left, cleaning up the kitchen and feeding the animals. But every now and then, her gaze would drift toward the barn. Was he okay? Had he fallen asleep yet? What was going through his mind? Around midnight, when everything was still, the woman finally gave in to her curiosity. She grabbed a thick blanket, intending to take it out to the barn in case the cowboy needed more warmth. She didn't want to wake him, but she knew how cold the nights could get out here. As she approached the barn, the door creaked open, and she stepped inside, careful not to make too much noise. The cowboy was still there, though he had shifted position, now lying on his back with his eyes closed. He seemed to be resting more comfortably, the pain from his injuries slowly easing, but there was still an air of sadness about him, a feeling of being lost in a world that wasn't his own. The woman stood there for a moment, watching him. She had always been a solitary person, but there was something about this man, this stranger, that made her want to help him more. She didn't know why, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. She didn't know if he would ever open up to her, but that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she had given him a place to rest. She gently draped the blanket over him and whispered, "Rest easy." She stepped back toward the door, closing it softly behind her. Outside, the night air was crisp, the stars bright against the dark sky. She walked back to her house, her mind quiet for the first time that evening. But something inside her still felt unsettled. There was more to this cowboy than met the eye, and she knew that he wasn't just any lost traveler. There was a story behind those tired eyes, a past that he wasn't ready to share. But one thing was certain. He had come to her for a reason, and his presence here was no accident. Whatever it was that brought him to her barn, it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The morning light broke through the cracks of the barn, casting thin beams of gold across the floor. The woman had already been awake for a while, her mind filled with the events of the night before. She had tried to shake the feeling that there was something more to the cowboy's story, but no matter how much she tried to focus on her chores, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. She had never been one to pry into other people's lives, especially those of strangers. But there was something about him that made her want to know more. Why had he ended up here of all places? What was he running from, or was he just passing through? The questions kept circling her mind, unanswered and heavy. The woman finished feeding the animals and went inside to prepare breakfast, though she barely touched the food herself. She set the table, her hands moving on their own as she kept thinking about the cowboy. He had barely spoken since the night before, but she could still sense a heaviness in the air whenever he was near. It wasn't just the pain from his injuries. There was a deeper sadness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. After a while, she couldn't resist the urge to check on him again. She put the last of the bread on the table and grabbed a mug of coffee, walking outside toward the barn. The early morning air was cool, and the smell of the earth was thick, like the land itself was waking up from the night. As she approached the barn, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. She hesitated, wondering if she should knock first, but then decided against it. There was no harm in simply checking on him. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The cowboy was sitting up now, his back leaning against the wall of the barn. He seemed to be staring at nothing, lost in thought as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. His eyes were far away, distant. The woman lingered by the door for a moment, watching him. She wasn't sure if he had heard her approach, but he didn't seem to notice. She took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice gentle so as not to startle him. The cowboy didn't immediately respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward her. There was a moment of silence before he spoke. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice hoarse but calm. "You didn't have to come out here." "I'm all right." The woman raised an eyebrow, unsure if she believed him. The way he said it made it sound as though he was trying to convince himself rather than her. "You don't look all right," she replied, her concern evident in her tone. "You should eat something. I've got breakfast ready." He seemed to consider this for a moment before slowly pushing himself to his feet. He winced slightly as he straightened up, but it was clear he was trying not to show any weakness. "Thanks," he said, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze softened just for a moment. "I appreciate it." They walked back to the house together, the silence between them comfortable but filled with unspoken words. The woman had learned long ago not to rush people. She knew that trust took time. But there was something about this man that made her want to break through that barrier and help him, even if he didn't ask for it. Once inside, she set a plate of food down for him, watching as he slowly sat down at the table. He didn't rush to eat, as if he were savoring the warmth of the meal and the comfort of being in a safe place. The woman took a seat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug of coffee. The cowboy took a few bites in silence before finally speaking again. "Do you always help strangers?" he asked, his voice quiet but curious. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Not always," she replied. "But you looked like you needed it. I don't turn people away when they're in trouble." He nodded as if processing her words. He didn't ask any more questions, and neither did she. For a while, they simply ate in companionable silence, the only sound the occasional clink of silverware against plates. After breakfast, the woman began clearing the table, wiping down the dishes with quick, practiced movements. The cowboy didn't offer to help, but he didn't seem to mind either. It was clear that he was still recovering from whatever had happened, but his silence was beginning to make her more curious. "Are you planning on staying here long?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. The cowboy paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment he seemed to weigh his words carefully. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I've been traveling for a while. I don't really have a destination, just needed to get away." The woman stopped what she was doing, her interest piqued. "Get away from what?" He hesitated again, his eyes drifting to the window as though looking for the right words. She could tell he wasn't ready to share everything, and she didn't want to push him. But her curiosity was getting the better of her. "I guess everything," he said, his voice tinged with a weariness that was hard to ignore. "Life hasn't been kind lately. I needed to clear my head." The woman nodded slowly, understanding more than he knew. She had her own reasons for being here, for living this life of solitude. Sometimes people just needed space to breathe, to figure things out without the weight of the world pressing down on them. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," she said gently. "I'm not much for company, but you're safe here." The cowboy looked at her for a moment, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." There was something in his voice that made the woman's heart ache. She could see the pain in his eyes, the exhaustion that went beyond just physical injuries. It was as if he had been carrying something heavy for a long time, something that wasn't easily put down. "You don't have to explain," she replied, her voice steady. "Everyone has their own battles." For the rest of the day, they settled into an uneasy sort of rhythm. The woman showed him around the property, giving him small tasks to help with. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to keep him busy while he continued to recover. He didn't speak much, but he worked without complaint, and she appreciated the quiet company. As the sun began to set, the woman found herself standing on the porch, looking out over the land. She hadn't expected this to be the way her day would go, but something about having the cowboy here felt different. He had arrived with no warning, and yet, somehow it felt like he belonged. She wasn't sure if he would stay or move on when he was feeling better, but she knew one thing for sure. His arrival had changed something inside her. She had always lived a quiet, solitary life, but now, in the presence of this mysterious stranger, she realized how much she had longed for more. There was a world beyond these fields, beyond the quiet farm, and perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't meant to stay here alone forever. The cowboy came out to join her, standing a few steps behind, his hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. The two of them stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The silence between them comfortable, yet filled with unspoken thoughts. As the evening turned into night, the woman couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had a sense that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. The days seemed to pass quickly after that, as if time itself was moving faster with each passing moment. The woman had grown accustomed to the cowboy's quiet presence, and though he didn't speak much, there was something comforting about having him around. He was recovering slowly but surely, and his injuries were starting to heal, but there was still an air of mystery about him that lingered. an untold story he wasn't ready to share. The mornings were the same. They would wake early, have breakfast together, and then spend the day working side by side. The cowboy helped with the chores, though he always seemed a bit distant, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. The woman didn't mind. She didn't need him to open up to her, not yet. She had learned over the years that people revealed themselves in their own time, and she wasn't one to push. One afternoon, after finishing a long day of work in the fields, the woman sat on the porch wiping the sweat from her brow. The heat of the day was starting to fade, and the cool evening breeze felt like a welcome relief. The cowboy was sitting nearby, his legs stretched out in front of him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't say anything, but she could sense that something was on his mind. He had been like that lately, quiet, more withdrawn than usual. She didn't want to pry, but she couldn't help herself. Something about the way he had been acting made her wonder what was going on inside his head. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice gentle but full of curiosity. "Is everything all right?" The cowboy didn't look at her at first. Instead, he stared out at the land, his eyes lost in thought. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. It was as though he was weighing whether or not he wanted to share whatever was bothering him. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, as if the words were hard to come by, "about why I ended up here." The woman didn't say anything at first. She simply listened, her gaze steady and patient. She could tell that he was working through something deep inside himself. "Sometimes I don't even know what I'm running from," he continued, his voice low. "I've spent so long just existing. I thought leaving everything behind would help, but now I'm not so sure." The woman nodded, understanding more than he realized. She had spent a lot of time running from her own thoughts, from her past. Sometimes leaving everything behind was the only way to breathe again. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said softly. "Sometimes it's enough just to be where you are. Take things one step at a time." He looked at her then, his eyes searching her face as if he were trying to read her, trying to understand how she could be so at peace with herself. "I don't know how you do it," he admitted, his voice tinged with a hint of awe. "You're so content, so sure of where you are." The woman smiled, a small knowing smile. "I wasn't always like this. I've had my own share of battles just like everyone else. But sometimes all you can do is take a deep breath and let life unfold the way it's meant to." There was a long pause, and for a moment it felt like they were both standing on the edge of something unspoken but understood between them. The cowboy seemed to be grappling with something inside himself, and the woman could sense that he was close to saying something important. Before he could speak again, there was a noise from the barn, something small, a rustle of hay. The woman turned her head instinctively, and the cowboy followed her gaze. She hadn't expected anyone to be out there, but she stood up slowly, a sense of unease settling in her stomach. "Stay here," she said to the cowboy, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to say it. Something about the barn felt off. She made her way toward the barn, her footsteps light but quick. As she approached, she heard the sound again, soft, almost like the wind brushing against the walls. She pushed the door open slowly, peering inside. At first, everything seemed normal. The horses were in their stalls, the hay was neatly stacked, and nothing seemed out of place. But then she saw it. There, on the far side of the barn, was a small figure crouched down in the shadows. The woman's heart skipped a beat as she took a step forward, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm, though she couldn't help the tinge of uncertainty creeping into her tone. The figure shifted, standing up slowly, and the woman's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped into the light. It was a man dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by a worn-out hat. He didn't look familiar, and the way he stood there unmoving made her uneasy. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I didn't mean to scare you." The woman took a cautious step back, her hand instinctively resting on the handle of a pitchfork nearby. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm looking for someone," the man replied, his gaze flickering toward the cowboy, who had followed her to the barn and was now standing at the entrance. "I've been tracking a man for some time." The woman felt a knot form in her stomach as she glanced between the stranger and the cowboy. The cowboy's face had gone pale, and for the first time since he had arrived, he looked genuinely afraid. "You're looking for him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his expression hardening. He owes me a great deal of money, and he's been running for far too long." The woman turned to look at the cowboy who was standing in the doorway, his body stiff. He didn't move, didn't speak. It was as though he was frozen in place, unable to react. The tension in the barn was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. "You've been hiding here," the man continued, his voice dark, "and now it's time for him to face the consequences." The air inside the barn had thickened with tension, heavy with the presence of the stranger and his cryptic words. The woman stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing as she glanced between the cowboy and the man who had suddenly appeared. Her instincts told her that things were about to change, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The cowboy, for the first time since she had met him, didn't look like the man who had stumbled into her barn seeking help. His face, usually calm, was now filled with a mixture of fear and guilt, and his body was tense as though he were preparing for something terrible. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the cowboy with narrowed eyes, sizing him up as though he were a wild animal he was about to corner. Then his gaze shifted to her. "I'm just someone trying to settle an old debt," he said flatly. His tone left no room for negotiation. "I've been tracking him for a long time. He's not the person you think he is." The woman's mind raced. She could sense the truth in the stranger's words, but she didn't want to believe it. She had taken the cowboy in without asking questions, without knowing his past. She had seen the kindness in him, even if he had hidden most of it behind a wall. But now it felt like that wall was crumbling. "Debt," she repeated, feeling the weight of the word pressed down on her chest. "What kind of debt?" The stranger's eyes flicked back to the cowboy, and for the first time the cowboy seemed to crack. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. "Listen to me," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I came here to escape, to disappear, but it looks like I can't run anymore." The woman's heart pounded as she took a step toward him. "What are you talking about?" The cowboy met her gaze, and for the first time he seemed completely vulnerable. He had always been closed off, keeping his emotions locked away, but now he was letting them show. "I'm not who you think I am," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not just some lost cowboy. I'm a man who's been on the run for years." The woman's mind spun. What did he mean by that? Who was he really? The stranger seemed to sense the shift in her expression. "You're better off knowing the truth," he said, his voice soft but firm. "He's not some innocent man. He's part of something much darker." The cowboy flinched at the stranger's words, and it was as if something inside of him shattered. "I didn't choose this life," he said, his voice cracking. "But I couldn't get out, not without leaving everything behind. And I didn't know where else to go." The woman felt a pang in her chest. The pain in his voice was real, and though the stranger's words were harsh, they didn't change the fact that the cowboy had been running for his life. He wasn't just hiding from debt, he was hiding from something far worse. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady now despite the confusion swirling inside her. "What have you been running from?" The cowboy didn't speak immediately. He looked at the stranger, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and shame. "I was part of a group," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A group that did things I'm not proud of. I was a part of something illegal, something dangerous. And I couldn't get out, so I ran." The woman's breath caught in her throat as she processed his words. She didn't know what to think. She had taken him in, trusted him, and now this man who had seemed so kind and gentle was admitting to a past she could hardly understand. "You're part of a gang?" she asked, her voice thick with disbelief. The cowboy nodded, his eyes heavy with shame. "I was, but I didn't want that life. I never did. And when things got too dangerous, I left. I tried to disappear, but you can't just walk away from something like that." The stranger stepped forward. His arms crossed as he studied the cowboy with a mix of anger and resentment. "You think you can just run away from the past?" the stranger said bitterly. "You can't escape what you've done. You'll always be looking over your shoulder." The cowboy's eyes darkened as he stared back at the stranger. "I know that," he said, his voice low and rough. "But I had to try. I had to try to live a life where I wasn't looking over my shoulder every damn day." The woman felt a mix of emotions swirl inside her. Anger, confusion, and surprisingly, sympathy. She had no idea what this man had been through, what he had been running from, but she could see that it had taken its toll on him. "I don't know what you want from me," she said to the stranger, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. "He's not the person you think he is. He's been through enough." The stranger's eyes softened, and for a moment the anger seemed to drain from him. He sighed deeply as though the weight of everything was finally starting to settle on him. "I know," he said quietly, "but the truth is he's not free, not yet, and I can't let him go until he faces what he's done." The woman felt a sharp pain in her chest. This wasn't the cowboy she had met. He was a man torn apart by the past, trying to survive in a world that wouldn't let him forget. But could she really let him face the consequences alone? "You want him to go back to the life he ran from?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You want to drag him back into that?" The stranger hesitated as if the question had caught him off guard. "I don't want to drag him anywhere," he said finally. "But the world doesn't let people like him just walk away. It never does." The woman didn't know what to say. She wanted to believe the cowboy had changed, that he could leave his past behind, but the weight of the stranger's words lingered. How could she protect him from his past when it was chasing him? The cowboy, as if sensing her hesitation, stepped forward, his expression pleading. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to drag you into my mess. But I can't run anymore. I have to face it." The woman looked at him, her heart breaking. She wanted to help him, to protect him. But how could she when the past was so determined to find him? "You don't have to face it alone," she said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "You don't have to face it alone." The cowboy's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the woman saw a flicker of hope in his gaze, a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I don't know what I did to deserve your kindness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll never forget it." The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with empathy. "You don't need to thank me. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." As the words hung in the air, the stranger watched them both, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, his tone more solemn than before. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe he deserves a chance. But it's not my decision to make." The woman turned to look at the cowboy, her heart filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let him face it alone. The sun had barely begun to rise when the woman stepped outside to tend to her morning chores. The air was still cool, a perfect morning for the kind of work that needed to be done. Her hands, steady and practiced, moved quickly as she fed the animals and checked on the barn. She had always enjoyed these early hours, the peacefulness that came with the silence before the world awoke. But today was different. The barn, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt tense, as though something was hanging in the air, waiting to be addressed. She couldn't shake the conversation from the night before, the weight of the cowboy's confession, and the stranger's words that had echoed in her mind all through the night. She hadn't expected any of it. She had taken the cowboy in without hesitation, without questioning his past. And now the truth was out. He wasn't just a lost traveler. He was a man on the run, a man with a past too dark to leave behind. The woman hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the stranger and the cowboy's face, filled with regret and fear, flooded her mind. She had offered him a safe place to stay, but now that safety felt fragile, threatened by something she couldn't control. Still, she couldn't turn her back on him. He was a man torn by his past, a past that had shaped him into someone who felt more like a ghost than a man, and no matter what, he deserved a chance to live without looking over his shoulder. As the woman made her way back to the house, she caught sight of the cowboy standing near the fence, his back turned to her. He seemed to be lost in thought, staring out at the wide-open land as though seeking an answer to something that could never be found. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to disturb him. He had always been distant, never fully opening up, but after the events of the previous night, she knew he needed to talk. She walked toward him slowly, her footsteps light against the soft earth. When she reached him, she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply stood there beside him, giving him the space he needed, allowing the silence to settle between them. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly, his voice rough. She turned to face him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes. It wasn't just physical. It was the weight of a lifetime of regret, a lifetime of running. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said softly, her voice steady. One step at a time. That's all anyone can do. The cowboy looked at her then, his eyes searching hers for something. Comfort maybe, or reassurance. For the first time since he had arrived, he looked like a man who needed help. I've been running for so long, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to face it. The woman's heart ached for him. She could see that he was torn between his desire to escape his past and the realization that he couldn't keep running forever. You don't have to face it alone, she said gently. You have a choice. You can choose to stay here, to start over. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. The cowboy was silent for a moment, his eyes on the ground. Then, without warning, he turned away from her, walking a few paces before stopping again. I can't stay here forever, he said, his voice strained. I can't keep hiding. The woman followed him, her footsteps slower now, careful not to crowd him. You don't have to hide. You just need time. Time to heal. Time to figure out what you want. He turned to face her then, his expression conflicted. I want to stay. I want to forget all of it. But I don't know if I can. She stood still, her gaze soft but unwavering. You don't have to decide everything right now. Take it one day at a time. The cowboy let out a long, slow breath, and for a brief moment the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. Maybe I can stay, he said quietly. Maybe. Just for a little while. The woman smiled gently, relieved that he wasn't pushing her away. You don't have to make any promises you're not ready to keep. Just be here in the moment. The cowboy nodded, his gaze moving toward the horizon. The wind was picking up, a soft breeze that seemed to carry away some of the weight from his shoulders. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a glimmer of possibility. As the day wore on, the woman and the cowboy continued their work in silence. But there was a shift between them. The tension that had hung in the air the night before was gone, replaced by a tentative understanding. They weren't fully there yet, but for the first time, the cowboy seemed to be accepting that he didn't have to face his past alone. That night, as the stars began to twinkle in the dark sky, the woman sat on the porch, her eyes following the constellations above. The cowboy had retreated to the barn for the night, though she could tell he was still struggling. He hadn't said much, but there was a sense of relief in his posture, as if he had made a choice, even if it wasn't the final one. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether the past would come calling again. But for now, she was content with the quiet peace that filled the air. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The sound of footsteps approached, and the woman turned to see the cowboy walking toward her. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, watching her. She smiled and patted the space next to her, inviting him to sit. Mind if I join you? He asked softly. Not at all, she replied. He sat down beside her, his eyes moving to the stars above. There was a quiet comfort in the way they sat together. No need for words, just the shared understanding of what they were both experiencing. I've been thinking, the cowboy said after a long pause.
About what you said?
About starting over. The woman nodded, her attention still on the stars. And? I think I'm ready to try, he said quietly. Not to forget, but to move forward. The woman smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. That's all anyone can do. The two of them sat in silence for a while, watching as the night deepened and the stars blinked overhead. The air was cool, but there was a warmth between them, a connection that hadn't existed before. It wasn't an easy road ahead, but for the first time, the cowboy seemed to believe that he could face it. As the night wore on, the woman's thoughts drifted to the future, to what might come next. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many unknowns, but for now, she had a feeling that they were on the right path. And that was enough. The days that followed felt different. The woman could sense a change in the cowboy, though he didn't speak much about it. He had agreed to stay, at least for the time being, and while the tension still lingered in the air, there was an unspoken understanding between them. She had given him a space to heal, not just from his injuries, but from everything that had led him here. Every morning they would work side by side. He was quieter now, more introspective, but there was a subtle shift in him. His movements were less guarded, and he seemed to be more present, more engaged with the tasks at hand. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when he would retreat into himself, but they were becoming fewer. The woman watched him closely. There was something healing about the rhythm of the farm, something steady and grounding. She had always believed that hard work, simple and honest, had a way of clearing the mind, of giving a person the space to think without being consumed by the weight of the world. And for the cowboy, it seemed to be working. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields, the woman and the cowboy found themselves finishing up the day's work in the garden. The soil was rich and dark, and the crops were starting to thrive under their care. The woman wiped the sweat from her brow, glancing at the cowboy as he wiped his hands on his pants and stretched his back. He looked tired but content, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he looked at the progress they had made. "You've been working hard," she said, her voice light. "This place is looking better every day." The cowboy gave a small chuckle, a sound that felt like a relief after so much silence. "It's easier when you have someone to work with." She smiled in return, feeling the weight of the words settle between them. It wasn't just the farm that was improving, it was them too. They had both been lost in their own ways, but now, they were finding something in each other's presence. Something simple, something real. "I'm glad you stayed," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the breeze. "I wasn't sure what would happen, but I'm glad you're here." The cowboy paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. "I wasn't sure either," he said, his voice low. "But you gave me a chance. I didn't expect that." The woman felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Everyone deserves a chance," she replied. "Sometimes we just need to believe in ourselves a little more." He nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I've been running for so long," he said after a long pause. "I thought if I just kept moving, I could outrun everything I've done. But I know now that running doesn't work. It never has." The woman didn't say anything at first. She simply watched him, her heart heavy with the unspoken understanding that hung between them. He had been running, yes, but maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to stop. "You don't have to outrun it," she said softly. "You can face it. You can start over." He met her eyes then, and for the first time she saw something in him that hadn't been there before. Hope. A small flicker of belief that things could be different. "I don't know if I can ever truly escape my past," he admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But maybe, just maybe, I can make peace with it." The woman smiled gently. "That's all any of us can do." They stood there for a moment, just the two of them, taking in the quiet of the evening. The farm was peaceful. The sound of crickets chirping in the distance, the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees. It felt like a place of refuge, a place where they could both breathe and start to heal. That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, the woman sat on the porch again, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She had always enjoyed these quiet moments when the world felt still and everything seemed to slow down. It was a rare kind of peace, one that she had found here, on this land after years of solitude. The cowboy came out to join her, his steps slow but steady. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, his eyes on the stars. There was a certain weight to the silence now, a comfort in it. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice quiet. "About what?" she asked, turning her head slightly to look at him. I think I'm ready to let go," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "of all the things I've been holding on to. The fear, the guilt. I don't know what the future holds, but maybe it's time to stop running from it." The woman didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her heart full. She had known from the beginning that he carried a heavy burden, but now, it seemed like he was starting to put it down. "I don't know what will happen tomorrow," she said softly, "but I'm here for as long as you need me." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment their gazes locked, and in that silence there was an understanding, a promise even, that they weren't alone anymore. The next few days were quiet but full of subtle changes. The cowboy worked with more purpose now, his movements steadier, more confident. The woman noticed it in the way he carried himself, in the way he interacted with her, in the way he looked at the world around him. He wasn't completely healed, he still had his demons, still had his past, but there was something different now. He wasn't running anymore. One morning, after a long day of work in the fields, the woman found him sitting by the edge of the barn, looking out over the land. She could tell that he was deep in thought, lost in the memories of his past, but there was something else in his posture. It wasn't just the weight of the past. It was the weight of the future, the unknown. She approached him slowly, her footsteps soft on the dirt. "You all right?" she asked quietly. He turned his head slightly, offering her a small smile. Yeah, just thinking. The woman sat down beside him, the silence between them comfortable. The air was warm, the sun beginning to dip behind the hills in the distance. It felt like another moment of peace, another step toward something new. Do you ever wonder if you're doing the right thing? He asked, his voice low.